Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, decades-long tug of war. When we listen to our favorite music, we rarely think about the legal architecture that brought it to our ears. But behind the scenes, there's this constant, evolving battle over control, labor, and, of course, profit. To understand where we are today, we really have to look at a modern crisis that completely transformed the industry. Jay-Z actually hit the nail on the head when he said the digital era and file sharing tore a hole in the universe of the music business. Because historically, record companies relied on selling physical media, think CDs and vinyl, to capture value from artists. But when that core revenue stream just collapsed, the entire structural relationship between artists and labels was thrown into absolute chaos, forcing a radical shift in how contracts are actually written. So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The contract tug of war. 2. Primitive accumulation in music. 3. Overcoming legal limits. 4. The copyright time bomb. And 5. Enter the 360 deal. Okay, let's dive into part 1, the contract tug of war. Let's look at the very foundation of the music business, the employment contract. Record labels invest heavily in unproven talent, right? And they secure those risky investments through what are known as option contracts. Now, because labels have no idea who's going to become the next superstar, these contracts give the company the exclusive right to either renew or end the employment. If an artist flops, well, the label drops them. But if they blow up, the label exercises options to keep them locked in. Crucially, these contracts impose severe penalties for walking away, which effectively prevents artists from offering their talents on the open market. It's a mechanism that secures long-term control over creative labor, manages the employer's initial financial risk, and absolutely maximizes the potential upside. Moving right along to part 2, primitive accumulation in music. Now, to really make sense of this dynamic and this long-standing industry tug-of-war, we can look at an economic framework called primitive accumulation. Usually you hear this term referring to the historical enclosure of common lands, literally fencing off land so people had to go work for a wage just to survive. But in a modern economic sense, it represents capital's continuous, ongoing effort to enclose a social common. In the music industry, this means employers are constantly working to transcend any legal or traditional barriers that limit their capacity to capture an artist's creative labor and its resulting products. It's basically this endless drive to extend control wherever a limit presents itself. Which brings us perfectly to part 3, overcoming legal limits. Let's see how this actually plays out in the real world. For decades, the recording industry actively worked to transcend the legal limits set by state and federal labor laws that artists were using to protect their autonomy. As we can see here, there was a rapid series of legislative tugs of war. Whenever artists found a legal exit door, whether through state labor limits, compensation rules, bankruptcy, or even copyright law, the Recording Industry Association of America, or RIA, lobbied to change the rules to secure their investments. Let's zoom in on a few of these fascinating flashpoints. First up, we have what the industry dubbed the Olivia Newton-John problem. So California had this century-old law limiting employment contracts to 7 years to protect workers from endless bad deals. Well, in 1979, superstar Olivia Newton-John used this exact law to walk away from MCA Records, and the courts ruled the only penalty she faced was basically sitting out of the studio until those 7 years were up. Realizing this gave successful artists immense leverage, the RIAA engineered a legislative solution in 1987. Under the new amendment, artists could technically still leave after 7 years, sure, but labels were granted the right to sue for massive financial damages based on lost profits from any albums left uncompleted. The limit was legally bypassed by exposing the artist to massive financial risk. And this brilliantly illustrates the push and pull of labor law. California actually had another rule. A label couldn't get a court injunction, which is a legal order blocking an artist from jumping ship to a rival, unless the label had guaranteed and actually paid them a hefty minimum salary. Artists like Tina Marie successfully used this to escape contracts when labels hadn't paid those minimums. But in 1993, a legislative update completely changed the game. It allowed labels to secure that injunction at the very last minute by just paying 10 times the original minimum compensation deficit. The original intent of protecting the artist was basically bypassed, allowing the label to retroactively secure control only if the artist proved valuable enough to be poached. Okay, another major limit to corporate control was federal bankruptcy law. Back in the 90s, hitmakers like Run DMC, TLC, and Toni Braxton filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Why? Because a successful bankruptcy allows a judge to void executory contracts, which basically means ongoing unfulfilled agreements like record deals.
Now, the RIA argued that these artists were acting in bad faith, essentially extorting labels into renegotiating perfectly valid contracts. In response, they pushed hard for legislation to make recording artists completely exempt from these bankruptcy protections. While a specific artist exemption did fail after a major public outcry, the effort paved the way for the sweeping 2005 bankruptcy reforms that ultimately made it a lot harder for everyone in the U.S. to seek Chapter 7 relief.
All right, let's pivot to part 4, the copyright time bomb. Beyond labor and bankruptcy limits, let's shift our focus over to the battles over intellectual property rights, where another massive limit to corporate control was looming. The 1976 Copyright Act created what the industry nervously called a ticking time bomb. It established a termination of transfer right, meaning authors could reclaim control of their works 35 years after they originally signed them away. For record labels, this meant a massive leak in the vault. Highly lucrative master recordings from the late 1970s would become eligible to revert back to the artist starting in 2013, seriously threatening the label's hold on huge legacy revenue streams. So, to secure this intellectual property and stop this time bomb, a stealthy legislative maneuver was initiated. In 1999, an amendment was quietly added to a massive satellite television bill by an RIA lobbyist. This edition classified sound recordings as corporate works made for hire. Now, under copyright law, if a work is made for hire, the corporation is considered the author, which completely strips the actual artist of their 35-year termination right. Well, when artists and unions discovered this, a massive outcry ensued. It spread like wildfire, leading to rapid hearings and the eventual legislative repeal of the language. Finally, we arrive at part 5, enter the 360 deal. Bringing our timeline right up to the modern digital era, the collapse of physical record sales required an ultimate structural shift in the business. The legal tugs of wars we've discussed just weren't enough to keep labels highly profitable anymore. Traditionally, a record deal was a 90-degree slice of the pie. The label owned the record rights and, maybe a web store. But now, what's really interesting is how that reach expands outward. 120 degrees brings in limited touring. 240 degrees captures merchandising. And finally, we arrive at the modern 360-degree deal, where the label participates financially and administratively in book publishing, touring, all merchandising, sponsorships, endorsements, and sometimes even acting. The absolutely crucial point here is how this ties right back to our core concept of primitive accumulation. Historically, a pop star's ability to tour and sell merchandise was their self-provisioning commons. That independent revenue gave them the leverage to survive outside the label's direct control. But as CD sales collapsed, labels targeted these exact areas to survive. By retaining final decision-making power and taking revenue cuts over touring and merchandise, labels essentially enclosed what was previously an artist's independent commons to stabilize their own business models. Interestingly, while this feels totally new, it actually echoes historic multi-rights deals signed by manufactured bands like the Monkees and the Partridge Family decades ago. Today, however, the 360 deal is pretty much the prevailing industry standard for almost all new artists. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. As the music industry navigates a digital landscape where traditional sales have essentially vanished, we really have to ask ourselves, does the 360 deal represent a necessary, stabilizing partnership for survival in the digital age? Or is it the ultimate realization of unyielding corporate control over creative labor, erasing the last boundaries of artist independence? It's a complex question, and this tug of war is definitely going to continue evolving. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep looking deeper into the music you love.